I would like to start by thanking the African American Civil War Museum for sponsoring Lunch with the Descendants. It's an initiative to allow descendants to tell the story of their U.S. colored troop veterans. Today, I'm more than honored to speak on behalf of my great-great-grandfather, Philip McWhorter of Woodville, Mississippi. The title of my presentation today is The Life of Corporal Philip McWhorter, alias Philip Brown, 81st Regiment, U.S. Colored Troops. I've been able to reconstruct through documents the life of Philip McWhorter using a combination of early probate and deed records, estate records, court records, and census records from Wilkinson County. But it is really through the military pension file of Philip McWhorter that I was able to tell a lot of details and discover a lot of details about his life, his family's life, and the community in Woodville. So I will go through these documents and show you, and I think they represent the documentation so far on the life of Corporal Philip McWhorter. So the parents of Philip McWhorter were Philip, who is his namesake, who was born in 1802 in Alabama, and his mother was Sookie. She was born in 1808 in Virginia. The first time, this is the first document that shows the family of Philip McWhorter, and in this document, they're listed as collateral in a deed in trust by their owner, George Cooper McWhorter. And this is in Woodville, Mississippi. George Cooper McWhorter is the son of George Gray McWhorter, who was a Presbyterian minister from South Carolina who moved to Alabama, and then George Cooper McWhorter eventually moved into Louisiana and Mississippi. So here we have the family for the first time, Philip, Sookie, and their children, Rose, Betsy, James, and Blunt, being put up as collateral in a trust for some property that George Cooper McWhorter was mortgaging in Woodville, Mississippi. The next document a few years later shows the same family purchased by Elizabeth Burton Brown, also of Woodville. And everybody in this story of Philip McWhorter are in the town of Woodville, Mississippi, which I'll show you a little later in the presentation where that's located, exactly where that's located. But here the family is Phil, Sookie, and their children, Rose, Betsy, Jane, and Catherine. Elizabeth H. Brown, who is the wife of Jesse Brown, who is recently deceased, is purchasing the entire family for $3,539.63. So she is now the estate owner, purchasing enslaved people to work the plantation of her husband, Jesse Brown. Now, okay, so again, Elizabeth Burton marries Jesse Brown. She has, he dies, and then in 1842, there is a probate for his property. On that probate, it talks about her son, John Wilson Brown, who inherited the McWhorter family during his father. And when the will was probated in 1842, it shows all of the enslaved people that he received in that probate. And then John Wilson Brown, who contracted tuberculosis, he moves to New Orleans and takes some of his enslaved people with him. He took Philip, a 12-year-old boy, Lydia, and Eliza as personal servants. Then he dies out of state. So the death of John Wilson Brown becomes a court case. And that court case is entitled Elizabeth Steele versus the Corporation of Woodville, because she is contesting his property, who should be the owner of his property. And it leads to a large state case where they actually discuss the property of John Wilson Brown, who at the time of his death was in the state of Mississippi or in transition, with the exception of a Negro named Philip, left with John L. Lee in New Orleans. And this Negro named Philip is the son of the earlier Philip. This is actually the Philip who would join the U.S. colored troops years later. But here he is as a 12-year-old, as a servant. So be careful to understand that he had been to New Orleans as a servant of John Brown, left in New Orleans, but he would come back to Woodville once this case is decided. He would come back to Woodville and eventually marry Patsy. And they would be married approximately in between 1860 and 1863. Now, in one of the depositions to his pension file, I'll share what his sister, he had a sister, Millie Turner, who was one of the, who gave a deposition in the file. She was said she was born in about 1850. She was a sister of Philip. She testified. Of course, she knew him. She was his sister. She said Philip McWhorter or Brown had only one wife, and her name was Patsy. I don't know her maiden name. Philip and Patsy were married during slavery. I couldn't tell you who married them. I was not a witness to the marriage. They were married on the Steele place. They were man and wife when I first knew them. So Philip was on the Steele place owned by Elizabeth Brown, who then married Nathaniel Steele and took that family to the Steele place. The Steele place is significant. The picture I have on the map here shows, the picture I have on the screen shows a marker in the town of Woodville for William Grant Steele. William Grant Steele is the famous African-American composer, who is considered the dean of African-American composers. His family, his grandfather, was born on the same plantation, the Steele plantation, and they took the name Steele. So that family is identified as on that plantation at the same time that the McWhorters were on that plantation. And I'm just showing you this in terms of the relevance of knowing what the Steele plantation represented in the town of Woodville. So a couple of years later, Phil and Patsy have their first child, Sookie. And again, Sookie is the name of his mother. Phil and Sookie were his parents. She was born in 1808, and he names his first child Sookie in 1863. So this family went through several slave owners in Woodville. It started with George Cooper McWhorter, bringing them from Alabama into Woodville. Elizabeth Burden purchased them. She purchased them for her husband, Jesse Brown's estate. They were then given to her son, John Wilson Brown, who died and left Philip with John L. Lee. Nathaniel Steele, Elizabeth Burden then married Nathaniel Steele later. And then the family was sold again to Thomas Jefferson Brown. So this is typical in some cases of families being sold and mortgaged and given as gifts to family members. And this would be the early upbringing of Phil McWhorter. But in 1865, he would return to Woodville. He would enlist in the United States Colored Troops, Company A. This is his volunteer enlistment paper. In the town of New Orleans is where he enlisted under the name of Philip Brown. Under the name of Philip Brown, 22 years old, on January the 13th, 1865, he enlisted. Also on the right is his compiled military service record, which shows he was 22 years old. So if this was in 1865, he's born in approximately 1843. He's a laborer, it said, in New Orleans, complexion dark, height 5 feet 4 inches. So he's a short man. Mustered in January 17th, 1865 in New Orleans. Again, this is Company A, 81st Regiment, U.S. Colored Troops. So the 81st Regiment U.S. Colored Troops was started in Port Hudson, April 4th, 1864. And it derived from the Ninth Corps Afrique. The Corps of Afrique was the early African descent soldiers who were mustered into the army, and then they became the U.S. colored troops. Several other regiments, there were 18 regiments, became U.S. colored troops. Now, the map on the left shows the significance of not only the 81st Regiment, but all of the battle frontier of the Civil War in the Mississippi Valley area. So in the Mississippi River, Vicksburg, we know, was a key component because Grant was under siege at Vicksburg. The Union Army then asked that Port Hudson be freed, or Port Hudson become Union property so they could assist Grant at Vicksburg. Now, in between Vicksburg and Port Hudson is the town of Woodville. Right across the Louisiana line is the town of Woodville. Natchez also is not shown here, but Natchez is only 30 miles, so it's in the same vicinity as Woodville. So this is considered one of the key theaters of the Civil War. Some people say it is the key theater, where Mississippi River was where the Confederate Army used to transport all of its supplies. And if the Union Army could take Vicksburg and free Port Hudson, then they would be able to cut off all the Confederate supplies to feed the Confederate, that were feeding the Confederate Army. So a key area along the Mississippi River is New Orleans, which Philip McWhorter was well acquainted with. Baton Rouge, Port Hudson is right outside of the city of Baton Rouge, then Woodville and Natchez and Vicksburg. So this is one of the key theaters of the Civil War. And the 81st Regiment and other regiments were involved in that campaign at Port Hudson. So by 1880, Philip McWhorter has returned to Woodville. He worked in Woodville when he returned. By 1880, he's on the census. He has taken the name Phil McWhorter. McWhorter was the name of the family that brought him in from Alabama, brought his early family in from Alabama, even though he served under the name Philip Brown because he was on the Brown plantation when he went into the war. He came out of the war and took the name Phil McWhorter. On the 1880 census, he's 36 years old, so he's born about 1843. His wife, Patsy, is 32. She's born about 1847. And there is the oldest child, Sookie, who at 16 was born in about 1863. And you see the only gap in the family there, a 5-year gap, before he had the next daughter, Eliza, because he went off to war when shortly after Sookie was born. Also in the household, he has daughters, Emma, a son, Phil, Caroline, Millyanne, Fanny, and Jerry. And he would go on to have 14 children, 13 surviving, but 11 daughters and 3 sons. In 1890, he's listed on the veteran schedule of the U.S. Federal Census as Corporal Phil McWhorter. He's a Corporal Phil McWhorter, Company A, 81st Regiment, U.S. Colored Infantry. Now, this is the pension index cards for Phil McWhorter, which was filed August 11th, 1890. So immediately, those who are familiar with pension index card knows that this is a significant date because he filed that day, but it also has on this card a widow's claim, pension claim, and a minor's pension claim. So we know this is going to be exciting to find those claims. But on this card, Philip Brown, this was the first evidence I had of Philip McWhorter, and this was about 6 years ago. And he's Philip Brown, but he's Philip McWhorter, but he's alias Philip Brown on this card. On this card, he's Philip Brown and alias Philip McWhorter. So the first question I had was, is this the same Philip McWhorter that I knew on the 1880 census? The 1880 census was the only document I had on the family because he's not on the 1870 census and he's not on the 1900 census. So, we know later, we come to find out later that he had died by 1899. But there's also a widow's claim and then a minor's claim. So there was no family history or nothing passed down verbally about Phil McWhorter. This pension index card was the card that started me to find out the documents that led to the discovery of the life of Philip McWhorter. In his pension index file, he filed for his pension on August of 1890, shortly after the 1890 census, which alerted veterans that they were eligible for a pension. So he said it in the pension, he was in Company A, he served under Colonel Blackington. His file would result in a pension for him. He received about $8 a month beginning in 1890 for his pension. And mainly he had a heart problem. He had a heart valve problem. He had an irregular heartbeat. He also had rheumatism that he had contracted in the war and some other ailments, but the pension was granted for his heart problem that he had. Now, as we said before, that was a widow's claim. That was a widow's claim because he died. Now, this testimony here is also from the pension file. It's from his daughter, Caroline McWhorter. She said, my mother's father was named Alfred Williams, and her mother was named Sophie Williams. All of my mother's brothers and sisters are dead. My father died May 6, 1899 on the Chambers place. He had 3 children under 16 years of age at the time, and he died, and they are Taylor, Hannah, and Amanda. My mother died December 24th, 1899, 8 months after my father died. She filed application for a pension. So we do know that the date of death of Phil McWhorter was May 6, 1899. And then shortly after, his wife, who was due a pension, filed for a pension. She actually received a pension payment. She actually received approval for a pension payment of $14 a month, but she died in December, Christmas Eve, December of 1899, and never received any of the pension. So this is obviously tragic for a family of 14 kids. 3 of them were minors under 16. The others were very, very young. And both parents now are deceased. So what that meant was that the minor children were now due a claim for the pension. The minor children filed for a pension. One of the son-in-laws, Tobias Stewart, who was the husband of Caroline McWhorter, filed for the pension in 1900. It was not approved in 1900. So he filed again in 1904. In 1904, the pension was not approved, but he died by 1910. And the pension claim lapsed until 1930. In 1930, the U.S. Army did a special examination to see if the children were the children of Philip and Patsy McWhorter, and to see if they were minors. He had to prove that they were minor children, and they indeed were their children, and that Philip Brown and Philip McWhorter were the same person. So there was a special Army representative from New Orleans who came down, and he interviewed several of the family members of Philip McWhorter. Several of his children. I've showed you Carolyn McWhorter. He interviewed his sister, Millie Turner, some of his sons, his neighbors. So this was a very, very special file because it talked about his life, who he married, who his neighbors were, and in fact, it goes on to say who he was enslaved by, the kind of information you can only find in a U.S. pension file. Now, the claim, though, was awarded November 14, 1930, 30 years later, after the death of Philip and Patsy McWhorter. The 3 minor children, Taylor, Hannah, and Amanda, did receive a lump sum pension of $1,528. And this amount would have been the amount that they were due from the time of death, 1900, of both parents until they reached the age of 16. So that pension was finally awarded to them. By then, they were, of course, adults with children. Many of their sisters and brothers had passed on or moved out of town. So they would have had a very hard time with no parents, being supported mainly by other sisters and brothers. And they were due, it's a sad story, that they were due a pension because their father had served honorably as a Civil War veteran in the U.S. colored troops. So here's one account deposition given by the son of Phil McWhorter, and his name is also Phil McWhorter. And I'll just read it. He says, "My father was Philip McWhorter, and my mother was Patsy Williams. I always heard my father say that he rendered military service during the Civil War. And at the time he died, he was drawing a pension. He said he served under the name of Philip Brown. His master was Mr. Tom Brown, and my father was known as Philip Brown up to his enlistment, and he enlisted under that name. He told me that his birth name was McWhorter, but that when he was sold to the Browns, he used the name of Brown. He was raised on the Steel Place, which was owned by Mr. Tom Brown. I don't know what my father's height was, but he was a short man and small. So far as I know, he was born and reared here in Wilkerson County, Mississippi. I do not know what company and regiment he served in, and his discharge papers and pension papers have been destroyed by fire. I do not know who his officers were, but I heard him say that he served with one Sidney Hunt. His widow, Sarah Hunt, lives in Natchez." So this is an eyewitness testimony, very important, of the son of Phil McWhorter, who knew him, who talked to him, who discussed these things with him. Unfortunately for them, his papers were destroyed by fire, but those papers are in the pension file and in the military records, and I've been able to uncover them, especially with the use of these depositions to describe in depth the life of Philip McWhorter in Wilkerson County, Mississippi. So at the American Civil War Monument on Wall C, 81st Regiment, United States Colored Troop is honored. All of the names are there, including the name of Philip Brown, which is the name that Philip McWhorter served under in the Civil War. This is the certificate of honor I received on behalf of Philip McWhorter from the African American Civil War Memorial Museum. It's signed by Dr. Frank Smith, the founding director. And the last slide I'll show is a slide that shows the descendants of Philip McWhorter. The first Philip McWhorter from Alabama, born in 1802, died somewhere after 1860. The family, as I just described, was being sold repeatedly, sold and mortgaged and to different families. So they became split up. Corporal Philip McWhorter married Sookie. She was born in 1808. She was still alive in 1870. Now her name at that time was Sookie Jackson. So she had married someone else. Phil McWhorter, I assume, had died, but she had another husband, and she dies sometime after 1870. And so Philip McWhorter named his son, is actually his youngest son, Corporal Philip McWhorter, born in 1843, died in 1899. His wife, Patsy Williams, born in 1847, also died in 1899. Now, they were all his daughter. We talked about Sookie McWhorter, and this is a picture of Sookie McWhorter, born in 1863, and she died in 1931. Sookie McWhorter married Charlie Payne. These are my great-grandparents. Married Charlie Payne, who was born in 1862 and died around 1940. Their son, Cleveland Payne, was my grandfather, who of course, I knew very well, but he died in 1963. He married my grandmother, Beulah Veal. She was born in 1910 and died in 2000. These are my mother's parents, Edith Payne. My father was Nathaniel Blake's, and that's me. So this is the lineage of Phil McWhorter back to 1802 up until today. So the last part I'll do is I'll read a narrative I have. I'm going to read that on the life of Phil McWhorter. The life of Phil McWhorter in many ways reflects the long history of Africans whose ancestors were torn away from their African homeland and shipped in the Atlantic slave voyage to the Americas. Upon their arrival in the United States, their lives were rearranged as property to profit their owners. By the turn of the century, many had begun new families, but again were uprooted and sold into the U.S. domestic slave trade in Mississippi and the Deep South. Details of the life of former African ancestors is elusive and has been revealed through slave narratives or sometimes by plantation owners. The information in Phil McWhorter's Civil War pension file was the key in uncovering who his family was and reconstructing his life story. The pension file pointed the way to the owners and the plantation records, providing details about his life, the movement of the family, as well as his life in Mississippi during the awful days of slavery. Though he had accumulated very little money or property, after the death of he and his wife, they left behind a large family that would assure the passing down of his legacy for generations to come. Thank you. Okay, Don.
Hi, sorry about that. I was trying to come off mute. Thank you so much. This is fascinating. If anyone has any questions, you can place them in the chat, or you can feel free to come off mute to ask your question. I do have a question just to start it off with. What did you know about Philip McWhorter before, like while you were growing up, or was this something that you learned as an adult?
Absolutely didn't. I knew nothing about Philip McWhorter as a child growing up. And still, I don't have anyone in the family who knows, unless they've heard this story I've just read you, who knew anything about Philip McWhorter. So there was no evidence that we had a Civil War veteran in the family. Nobody's left who knows that story. So this story came to me first, I think it was 2016, in that index card, pension index card you saw. And from that point up until the day, I've been researching the story of Phil McWhorter. Okay. Now, there was one cousin who was still alive up to a couple of years ago, and I asked her, she's in New Orleans, I asked her, and she's descendant, she was the granddaughter of one of the children who received the pension, who didn't die until about, I think, 1969 in New Orleans. And she said she can barely remember, she thinks she remembers her grandmother did receive a pension. So that's been the only real collaboration. But other than that, it's not family history. It's just the documented proof that of Corporal Philip McWhorter.
Okay, and so this was just a journey that was inspired by you wanting to learn more about your family, and you came across him in that journey?
Absolutely. So the first thing was to discover, again, the only census he's in is 1880. Mm-hmm. So everything about him has to be discovered, discovered from that point, was really discovered once I received his pension file. Mm-hmm. Then to go back from the pension file to research his life on those plantations held by the Browns, the Steeles, to reconstruct his life.
Okay. Bernice Bennett has a question in the chat. She asked if you can speak of the many challenges the children experienced as they attempted to obtain their pension benefits.
Yeah. So again, a 30 years lapse between the time when they got the benefit. Some of the children, and you can imagine that the younger children were being raised by the older children. So they had scarce resources. They were all in that sharecropper system in Mississippi, where they worked, in the pea fields and worked in the cotton fields for someone on all of these plantations. So they had scarce resources. Some of them actually ran away, and some of the family members did corroborate that some of them actually ran away into Arkansas and Little Rock, looking for a better life. But the children were there for 30 years, and a lot of them had pregnancies real early. You can imagine a household or families with the mother and father deceased, and you're a minor. You're being raised by your sisters and brothers, how difficult that is. So, and I wonder, maybe sometimes that type of a hard life, it was hard enough for everybody in Mississippi. That type of a life is not why a lot of this was talked about. Some of the family members moved on to New Orleans and other places. All three of the pensioners moved on to other parts of Louisiana, to New Orleans and Baton Rouge. So the paperwork itself required to document that Philip McWhorter and Philip Brown was the same person, and that Patsy Williams was his wife, and that she was the mother of all three children, and that he was the father of all three children, required. That's why the pension file was so big and so detailed. There was a lot of questions about them, where they lived, when they had the children, who were the children's name, what were their birthdays. So that just went on to reveal more and more information about the family life in Mississippi.
Awesome. Are there any more questions from anyone in the audience?
I have a question. I wanted Alvin to speak about the ratings that were given to the informants by the examiners, okay, and what he observed in those ratings.
Sure. So the examiner, again, the Union Army examiner, examined, there were 11 depositions to the list of questions that he had on the life of Phil McWhorter and the life of his wife and their children. His ratings specified who he felt in the depositions, who he felt was the most truthful, who he felt was most reliable or not reliable in their testimony. One of the ratings that he gave was for Philip McWhorter's sister, Millie Turner. Her name was Millie Turner, where she testified who he was, that her mother and Philip McWhorter's father were not the same father, but they had the same mother. And she described in detail. She's born in 1850. So this is 1930 when she's doing the testimony. She's 80 years old. She's testifying who her mother was, who her father was, who his mother and father was. And as I showed you in one of the slides, where she's saying they were born on the steel plantation. I was on the steel plantation with them. When he finished her deposition, he said, she is old and feeble, and her testimony is not considered reliable. Well, her testimony is one of the testimonies that led me to a lot of the documents in terms of who her family, the people that she described was her father, in a list of enslaved people on the plantation. That name is right there. His name was Grundy Jackson, and her mother became Susan Jackson. She said her father was not Philip McWhorter, and she's born in 1850. Philip McWhorter is born in 1853. So when Philip McWhorter's father died, Sookie McWhorter moves on, and they have another Sookie Jackson, she would be then. They have another family. So all of the testimony she gave was accurate and true testimony that I've been able to document and prove through the documents. The other depositions from Carolyn McWhorter, saying her mother was Patsy Williams, and Patsy Williams' father was Alfred and Sophia Williams. Just on and on. Testimony that they were giving turned out to be true and accurate. And that testimony is really what led to discovery of that family in all these plantation records and in their life in Woodville, Mississippi. So the examiner, the Union examiner, in fact, he said most of the testimony he thought was not reliable. One or two of them, he said that the presentation was reliable. And one of the things he was looking for was birth certificates, a date of birth. We didn't have that in those days for plantation owners, for people who were enslaved. Sometimes slave owners wrote that in the Bible. Sometimes somebody may have wrote it down. But other than that, people who were not in school, who had been enslaved, did not have a record, did not even have a recollection of when they were born unless somebody told them that. So he's going up against people who were basically plantation workers. In 1930, they're just one generation from those who were enslaved, and he's asking them for dates of birth, for marriage dates and things like that. So his ruling about what was reliable, what was not reliable, that oral history they gave, which is really the way they communicated, that oral history was true, accurate, and 100% correct.
Mr. Blakes, thank you so much for such an informative presentation. And I know you're focusing on Woodville and Wilkinson County in Mississippi. We just wanted to know if you've looked at any of the plantation records, if you're still researching your family's history. The plantation records in the papers of people like James Payne. I noticed one of the surnames is Payne. You talked about the Steele plantation. There was also a Stiles plantation, S-T-I-L-E, that could have been interpreted as Steele as well. That may be another lead for you. All these were plantations that were in the Natchez district and across the river in Louisiana. So many of these plantation owners had far-reaching plantations from Wilkinson County all the way past Vicksburg into the Delta. So that's just a little bit of information that I think I can share based on what you presented so far, if you're still doing research on your family.
Yes, thank you for that. I'm always doing research. And let me say this, the Steele plantation, I don't know that Stiles was connected to it, but Steele, Nathaniel Steele, the wife of Elizabeth Steele, he died a few years after that. And I'm pretty sure about the Steele plantation in Wilkinson County and who was on it, the whole list. Like I said, William Grant Steele's family came off that plantation. On the Payne family, it's another layer of research. The Payne family, I've discovered, came from, it's a long story, so I won't get into it. But the Payne family was brought into Woodville by Jacob U. Payne. So I know that story also. Jacob U. Payne came from Missouri. He's the one who had a big house in New Orleans. Jefferson Davis died at Jacob U. Payne's house. So I'm not going to get off into that history, but yes, the thing I've been able to do in Wilkinson County in Woodville is to research these plantations on several branches of my family all the way back to the late 1700s. And so what I do is if I can collect all of the story of how they came, who they came with, and the story of McWhorters is a very instructive story, because several branches of my family, these were soldiers who fought in the Revolutionary War in 1776. When they fought in that war, they were given land grants, huge sums of land. They moved to Alabama. They came from South Carolina, or say North Carolina, or one of those areas. They moved to Alabama and Tennessee later on, and then moved into Woodville later. They had land, they had money. So what that land did was spur on them purchasing and enslaving people to work their land and profit for them. So that's a common theme in this part of Mississippi. Soldiers who received free land and they had money. Now that the purchase of enslaved people was spurred on by that. So that's a whole area we have to really re-examine what the U.S. Revolutionary War meant to us in terms of driving that domestic slave trade and driving that need or that thirst they have to make windfall profits by enslaving people to work that land.
Hey, Alvin, this is Stacy. The pension file, were you able to get that in DC, or did you have to go to, because I know a lot of times that when cases go on and they go into the 1930s, a lot of times they're not available in DC, that you have to go to the state to where the case is still being looked at or reviewed. Did you have to do that, or by this time was everything up in DC?
It was in DC. In fact, Bernice Bennett, who pulls pension files and helps people who are looking for their pension records, was able to pull that in DC. So that file was there. It was intact with all this information. That file ended up being about 100 pages. Like I said, 11 depositions, affidavits, all types of records. It was 3 files. So that's why the file was so large. There was the soldier's file, the widow's file, and the minor's file. And in fact, that the case drug on meant that the evidence would be there in that file, especially as late as 1930. They're giving depositions on things that happened And there were people on there who were born in slavery giving depositions. Millie Turner was born in 1850 in that area. Alex Stewart, Anderson Beffley, I believe. About 4 or 5 of the deponents were actually born in slavery. They were enslaved people who were speaking still alive in 1930 and speaking of their plantation conditions back in the 1830, I think as early as 1830. One man gave an affidavit that said he knew the McWhorters, he knew Phil and Patsy when they were married, and he knew their first child, and he knew when he went off to war. So by 1930, you have people who are still alive. I mean, this is as good as or better than slave narratives to have this kind of information in a pension file. So I would encourage, by way of encouragement, I would ask anybody, deplore you to, if you have a Civil War veteran or you think you have one, go and get the pension file, because you never know what information is inside that pension file.
Hi, Mr. Blake. I'm not too sure with how the funds were at that time, but I believe you said there was like 1,500 distributed.
Yes, so $1,528, I believe it was.
So
three children should have started to get their pension in 1900. Mm-hmm. They got no money in 1900. It took 30 years to get it. So by the time they get it, say one was about 12 years old. So that one was due, I think it was the oldest one, Taylor, from 12 to 16 for 4 years. If he would have gotten $10 a year, $10 a month pension, that would be $120 a month times 4 years. That's $500 would have belonged to him. That's how you do it. And the other two would have gotten some proportion of what they would do. So that's how it's proportioned out. Up until the age of, from whatever age they were when the parents died, up until the age of 16, that would be the distribution for the proportional distribution for the 3 children.
I see. So that brings me to 2 questions. Was there interest on the money? And was a bank the one who distributed this money? And I apologize, I don't know how it worked when the money was distributed.
I don't know either. I don't have a record of that. I don't see a record. There was no, for instance, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, are you talking about the distribution of pension funds? I mean, the pension, the soldier's pension?
Well, this is Star, and I am talking about the funds whatever funds that was given to the family. I mean, 30 years just to receive that lump sum. Is there any way that we can, determine if there was interest? Because I don't know. To me, it just seems like there should be more.
Well, okay. Again, now let me be clear. It's not 30. It's not, the money doesn't run for 30 years. The money only runs from when the minor child, say is 12 years old, the money they would due is from 12 to 16. When they turn 16, the money is cut off. So even at that amount, it's not a lot of interest on that amount of money. Now, the interest did not run. I don't think it ran for 30 years. They were given interest on the money that they didn't receive, but they would get the money. They would get the money from the years that they would do it. One got maybe 4 years worth of pension money. One got 6 years, and one got, say, 8 years. Sum all those together, and you have $1,528.
And then my last question was, do we know what bank, or was it distributed through the bank, or how was that distributed?
I don't know. I haven't found that. I don't know if there's a record of that even. I know that one card you see in the on the slide is the payment information. Mm-hmm. That's all I have. There was no, pension payment schedule or anything that you normally have for a pensioner. There was none of that. What you see is that one lump sum ticket there. Okay. So unless there's other files, I don't know if I'll be able to discover that. But
thank you.
Believe me, I was glad enough when I saw that they did get paid. I was glad enough to discover that.
Thank you.
Sorry. For pension files, if it's a pension payment, that payment comes directly from the federal government. That it doesn't go through a bank.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. It goes straight
Thank you.
It goes straight into their hands. Somebody delivers it straight into their hands.
During those days, you could basically go to basically an office and pick it up, or basically it would be sent to you.
Mm-hmm.
So this would be like a note that you could cash against the bank. That's mostly how people did it, because, you know, the pensions were distributed nationwide, but, you know, they didn't have it go like to a bank and then a private bank distribute it. It's sort of like, you know, kind of like, I guess you could say like Social Security today. They process Social Security through Social Security and they send it out to that person's account. So during that time period, the federal government pensions office worked with the Treasury to process pension payments that would be sent out to individuals via a bank note that they could go to a bank and cash. So usually they went to their own bank or to a bank that was in their community to cash that.
Mm-hmm. So Dawn, you've seen these kind of retroactive lump payments paid out before?
Yes, and usually a retroactive lump payment for a pension, they don't, so for pension files at this time, now the government does pay retroactive payments from time periods. For example, if you came out of like your service ended at this point in time period for the time period of your service. For retroactive lump payments during this time period, it's whenever the file was deemed to be like, they got a sufficient amount of information to prove that person's service and that it should have been approved at this time. So if the pension for those children would have been approved on, let's say, July 3rd, 1870, I'm just throwing out here a date, they would pay retroactive to that time period. But there were very few retroactive time payments paid during that time. So this is pretty rare.
Mm-hmm. And do you know if for that ticket you see on that slide I showed, $1,528, would there be another record of that somewhere in the government files?
Usually everything that is related to your pension payment and file would be in the pension file. They would throw everything in there, even a envelope where they sent you the payment would go in there. Some kind of copy of that information would go in the pension file. If it's not in the pension file, then basically nobody saved it. There was no standard of information that had to be saved as far as like related to pensions during that time period. Now we do have like some standards as far as like, this is what we need to do. This is the code of conduct, the pathway that we have to follow in order to make sure that basically a soldier or his family gets their due payment.
Very good. Thanks for that.
Mm-hmm.
So Don, I see a question in the chat about this presentation and the chat, the notes in the chat. Is that going to be stored somewhere where people can see it later?
Yes, I am working on getting them placed on YouTube. I have a number of back ones that have to go up on YouTube, and they will be shared out on social media, as well as the website when the tech person is done with that.
Okay. And let's see, I don't see any other questions in the chat.
Okay, if we have no other questions, I want to thank you for your presentation. It was definitely very insightful. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us. If you are interested in doing a presentation of your own, you can reach out to me and I'll go ahead and quickly put my email in the chat box. If I can spell it. And you can send me an email. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thanks everybody for joining.